So welcome to the 2007 Wilderness Issues Lecture Series, Visions and Voices, Visions and Voices, Writers on Conservation, Wildness, and Nature. I'm Laura Young, I'm the director of the Wilderness Institute, and this series is sponsored by the Wilderness Institute here at the University of Montana. We're part of the College of Forestry and Conservation, and co-sponsored by the UM Environmental Studies program. And I'd like to first just start off by recognizing Phil Condon, who's sitting right there. He's my partner in developing this lecture series. He's with the UM Environmental Studies program. So I'd like to start off by thanking the Dana Gallery and the Montana Museum of Art and Culture for generously donating artwork for promotional materials for this series. And I'd like to also thank the Montana chapter of the Society for Conservation Biology, who also helped sponsor the event tonight. If you haven't yet seen the full series schedule, I'd encourage you to pick up a paper schedule outside on the table, outside in the lobby on a table. We've got a great lineup of writers who are speaking this spring, including Phil Condon, Rebecca Solnit, Allison Deming, David James Duncan, Janine Benyus, and Leslie Ryan. In fact, our next speaker next Tuesday, will be Janine Benyus. She's the author of Biomimicry and Design. She speaks internationally on biomimicry and, in fact, is meeting with the King of Sweden and speaking in front of the European Union this coming year. Also, I want to let you all know that Missoula Community Access Television is filming tonight. So if for any reason you have to step out early, please do so quietly. And television's right here. If you ask a question, you may be on television a few weeks from now. David Quammen, our speaker tonight, will be talking for about 45 minutes, after which we'll have question and answers until about 8:30. Immediately after the talk, after the question and answer series session, David will be in the lobby signing books. And so if you'd like to purchase a book and have David sign it, you can proceed to the lobby. Or if you just want to talk to David, that's where you'll find him. Instead of finding him up here, you'll find him in the lobby. And now I'd like to welcome Sanjan, lead scientist with the Nature Conservancy, who has worked on international conservation initiatives in Africa and elsewhere around the world. He'll be introducing David Quammen tonight.
Thank you, Lori. A decade ago, when I was a graduate student, David Quammen published a remarkable book that some call the finest in science writing. And this book really revolutionized the way in which we conservationists saw our place in the world and the work we did. It excited us, it inspired us, and maybe it elevated us to, if not superstar status, at least it made us seem less of a nerd than we really were. This book, of course, is Song of the Dodo, and it's become gospel for graduate students around the world. It is standard reading for every person in marketing and philanthropy at the Nature Conservancy. It's a book I have recommended to every single class in conservation biology I've ever taught. There's a chapter within this book called Rarity Onto Death, and it's about the dodo, a bird that Quammen masterfully calls competent within its context. Sometimes we feel that way in our jobs. But that chapter masterfully balances a clinical description of biological extinction with a real heart-wrenching polemic about the death of the last of a species. Only Quammen could have done it that way. If you read that chapter, you will never see extinction in quite the same way again. David has gone on to publish almost a dozen other books. Most recently, The Reluctant Mr. Darwin, published in 2006. He writes frequently for Harper's, The Atlantic Monthly, Outside Magazine, Smithsonian. He is currently a contributing writer to National Geographic, and he is the Wallace Stegner Professor of Western American Studies at Montana State University. Today, he's going to be talking to us about Michael Fay, an explorer and conservationist from the Wildlife Conservation Society. Michael, in his own words, took the path of least resistance through 2,000 miles of Central African jungle on foot, the mega transect. And those of you who know Mike probably know that he views risk in a very different way than you and I view risks. Mike, after all, is quite mad, which makes what David Quammen did all the more remarkable. David followed on foot for 2 months, and in that time chronicled the breathtaking discoveries, the missteps, and the mishaps that happened on that journey. Please join me in providing a really warm welcome to someone who is a remarkable contributor to conservation biologist, and a very fine writer, David Quammen.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you all. Thank you. Holy mackerel. What a nice crowd. Isn't there a basketball game or anything else going on to distract people away tonight? It's very nice to see you all. And I'm flattered by this turnout. And it's always great to be back in Missoula, where my own relationship with the state of Montana began just going on 34 years ago.
I'm going to up the volume a tiny bit. We're just trying to
How's
increase
that?
the volume.
Is that better? Am I not talking loud enough?
In the back, is that good?
Okay. And I'll try to stay close to this mic, or at least I'll try to holler if I'm not close to it. By the way, I don't know the person's name, but if you lost your wallet in the ladies' restroom in the last few hours, relax. This young lady over here, Nikki, has it for you, and you can get it after I'm done flapping my jaw. I'm going to talk very informally tonight about this subject, the mega transect. And as you can see, I have brought my high-tech audiovisual presentation with me. I'm assuming that if you wanted beautiful photographs, you would have invited Nick Nichols tonight, the photographer on the Mega Transect project, and not me. So this is very, very low tech. I don't show photographs. I don't do PowerPoint. I just talk, and sometimes I wave my arms and tell stories. And my purpose tonight, I have 3 purposes tonight. One is to tell the story, or some of the stories of the Mega Transect, this epically mad expedition across Central Africa. The second purpose is to describe that place or those places to you just a bit. And I hope to help you, even without photographs and with the aid of my highly sophisticated map, to begin to see that place, some of those places. And my third purpose, if we have time, is to try and use this story and that place perhaps to throw a little bit of light on the larger subject of this series, wilderness. What we mean when we use that word, why we value it, and how we go about preserving those values. I hope there'll be some back and forth on that. I have some thoughts, and I'd like to hear your thoughts, just to see if there's anything from this particular amazing place and this expedition that tells us anything about what wilderness is, how we think of it, how we do or should relate to it, and its rarity on this planet. Parenthetically, I haven't said thanks, but I do want to express warm thanks to the Wilderness Institute, the Environmental Studies Program, the local chapter of the Society for Conservation Biology, for welcoming me as part of this series. The Environmental Studies Program, by the way, has a couple of special connections to me. One is that my wife, Betsy Gaines, graduated from it about 10 years ago, and the other is back 30-some years ago when I was a bartender and bar manager at the depot. Most of my close pals and colleagues there were working their way through the environmental studies program, carrying steaks and pouring drinks at the depot. So, with that said, let me start by asking you to imagine you're in a large Army helicopter, one of those big 10, 15, 20-person troop transport double rotor helicopters. This helicopter belongs to the Gabonese Army. It's chartered by the National Geographic Society, and you're in it flying across Central African forest, equatorial jungle. You're flying at about maybe 1,000 feet off the top of this continuous, unbroken tropical forest canopy. You fly for 2 or 3 hours in this helicopter. There's a Gabonese pilot and co-pilot flying the thing. You're with a couple of other people, one of whom is a young Japanese primatologist named Tomo Nishihara, who functioned as the all-purpose logistics man on the Megatransect. So you and Tomo and a couple of other people are sitting in this helicopter, flying across this forest, looking down on just an ocean of green, the tops of trees, almost completely unbroken, except occasionally you see a thin streak of red, which means a red clay road cutting into the forest. Very, very occasionally, because there aren't many roads in Gabon. You fly for about 3 hours over this flat, continuous forest, and you're flying toward a GPS point, a set of longitude, latitude coordinates to the third decimal place that's been passed to the pilots from Tomo, to whom it was passed by satellite phone. Suddenly you see rising in front of you, out of this low, flat forest canopy, a huge gumdrop of granite, about 1,500 feet high, just like a big chicken croquette, maybe, sticking up out of the jungle. And it's nearly bare of vegetation. There's a little scruff of vegetation, maybe at the top. But this is like El Capitan, suddenly, in the middle of the Central African forest, sticking up. And that's one of your visual markers. You start to circle. The pilots are zeroing in on the GPS points. And then you see sort of a lower, kind of a whaleback, humpback, hogback version of the same sort of thing. A granitic dome that rises up out of the forest, much lower, but still prominent above this canopy. You start circling that, and now you start to realize that the GPS point is on that lower granitic dome. The helicopter comes in. As it gets closer, you start to see some figures down there going like this. The helicopter lands, you jump out, Tomo jumps out, and a small American fellow, about 5'8", 120 pounds, wearing shorts, no shirt, with sandy, short hair that's starting to go gray, and skinny shoulders, walks up to you, shakes hands with you, says, "Welcome back. This is Mike Fay." And he says, almost immediately, without any sentimentalities or anything else, "I've been getting some interesting data." He's been getting some interesting data. This is day 292 of his walk across Central African forests. He's been getting some interesting data. You say, "Like what, for instance?" He says, "Well, there are no gorillas in this forest, and it's great gorilla habitat. In the last 10 days, I've heard no chest beats. I've seen no gorillas. I've seen no gorilla nests. I've only seen one pile of gorilla dung. I expected to see hundreds in this stretch." You say, "Oh, what do you suppose that means?" He says, I think they've died of Ebola. And then he explains that this particular patch of forest is bordered by a river along which there are some villages in which there were human outbreaks of Ebola back in 1996, and also reports of piles of dead gorillas lying in the forest. And he thinks that possibly Ebola has killed off the gorillas in this forest. Gorillas being as susceptible to Ebola virus as humans are. So begins your next 2 weeks of walking with him. Welcome to the Mega Transect. This is J. Michael Fay. Another image, another thing to imagine. You're with Fay and his pygmy point man, a fellow called Bebe. By the way, the music that we were hearing, we were hearing forest sounds and Babangeli pygmy music beforehand on the soundtrack, and maybe we'll hear a little bit of it later on. Recorded by a fellow named Louis Sarno in the Republic of Congo. Anyway, now you're with Fay. You're in an area of eastern Gabon between you're in Republic of Congo between the Sangha and the Lengwe rivers. The pygmy is chopping with a machete for minutes, hours, all day. He is chopping. You're in something that feels to you like the most dense sugarcane field ever planted. There are stalks of a particular kind of monocot vegetation called Marantaceae, that's the family, that are each about the size of a pencil. They rise up about 15 feet tall, and in any given, say, square meter of this area, there are probably 500 to 1,000 of these stems per square meter. Is that possible? Anyway, it's very, very dang thick. Chopping. He's chopping. Fay stands behind him holding his little yellow Write in the Rain notebook, occasionally scribbling a note. Although there's not much to see. There is very little wildlife and very little vegetation other than the sea of Marantaceae stems. And you're standing behind Fay, and the pygmy cuts for about 20 minutes, and then he takes 2 steps forward. Fay takes 2 steps forward. You take 2 steps forward behind Fay, and then again you wait for the cutting. It gets hot. There's no forest canopy here. This goes on all day. Occasionally Fay looks at his GPS to see where you are and looks at his map to see where you might want to get to that day. For instance, you might like to get to water by the end of the day. At the end of the day, after 7 or 8 hours of this, according to the GPS, you have traveled about a mile. The rest of the pygmy crew catches up behind you, carrying bags of equipment, tents, food, waterproof bags, holding computers, various other high-tech data gathering things, medical kit, etc. And then the pygmies proceed to clear a campsite for that night. And they cut for another half an hour just to get these stems cleared away enough so that you can put up tents. Okay. This is about day 192 of the Mega Transect. Now imagine that you get away from that, but Fay can't get away, and he continues to go through that stuff in this particular corner of the Republic of Congo for 10 weeks. 10 weeks without relief. He's cutting through this area, and eventually he names it the Green Abyss. Probably no human has been through there in decades. for one very good reason. No human has wanted to go through there or had any purpose or seen any gain in going through there for decades. But eventually Fay crashes out the far side into a place called Odzala National Park, and it continues. One more image I ask you to imagine. You've been walking with Fay and his pygmy crew through some reasonably nice open forest, say what they call Gilbertiodendron forest, a particular kind of hardwood. The pygmies call it Bemba. The forest canopy is continuous, therefore the understory is fairly open. There's some saplings, there might be some lianas and vines on the ground. Possibly there are some elephant trails, and when there are elephant trails, you can walk along those elephant trails as long as they're going in the direction that Fay's compass tells him he wants to go, and you can follow them. Beautiful walking, a wonderful day. At the end of 8 hours, you've made 6 miles. The pygmies build a camp. They start cutting down saplings and erecting ridge poles for a big sort of cook tent under a tarp, and cutting places for the smaller tents that you're all sleeping in. And at some point, one of the pygmy fellows lets out a yelp as they're cutting with machetes to clear the understory. And everybody goes over to see what this yelp is about, and lying there on the forest leaf litter, all this brown and gray and purplish and black leaf litter is a gorgeous, gorgeous mottled brown and gray and purplish and black Gabon viper, curled up placidly. A snake that is probably only about 6 feet long, maybe 7 feet long, but weighs probably 20 or 25 pounds. This is one of those snakes that spreads out like pancake batter on the ground. And there it is, curled up with its head sort of tucked in the center, just waiting, because this is a sit and wait type of hunting snake, waiting for some kind of a rat to go by or for a bird to land near it. Not really waiting for a human to step on it, because the snake doesn't want that. It doesn't want to bite somebody that's a human that can't be swallowed. But if somebody does step on it, almost by reflex, the snake would bite. So there it is, sitting there in the middle of what you've decided is the campsite on this leaf litter. So your colleague Nick Nichols comes over with his cameras, and he loves the look of this thing, and he's shooting photos, and Mike Fay comes over and he's admiring the snake too, and they keep getting closer and closer and closer, and the tripod at 5 feet is no longer good enough for Nick, and now he wants to lower the tripod and set it 3 feet from the snake, and you're calculating, I wonder what the strike distance is of this snake from coiled position. And you're enjoying the snake too. It's a beautiful, beautiful animal, but it's a dangerous animal. And finally, after about an hour, the photographers are done, and so somebody takes a little piece of, and nobody wants to disturb this snake. And Mike says, no, don't disturb it, just leave it when we're done. Leave it in the middle of the camp. So for safety purposes, somebody takes a little strip of day glow orange marking tape. You know what I mean, that stuff that biologists and surveyors use. And ties it around a twig right above this snake. So there it is, you can look. You know, as you walk across camp, you can see there's the orange flagging. So you go and you get your tent set up and you get settled in, and maybe you go to the campfire and have a cup of tea, and you walk around camp. Maybe you go to the latrine on the other side of camp, or maybe you're going to do that in the middle of the night. And then you go down to the little stream. You walk through camp to go down to the stream, and you wash yourself, and then you come back up, and then you say, I think I'll go take a look at the snake again. And you walk back to the orange flagging, and the snake is gone. And you just think, wonder where he is now. Welcome to the mega transect. All right, this is, I wanted to give you a little of the flavor of it. The story in very rough outline goes like this. It begins with forest blocks in Central Africa. And I'm now going to go to my high-tech graphics display for just a minute. You guessed this was Africa, right? Yeah. Okay. Congo River, the Great Congo River. Democratic Republic of Congo, former Zaire, is south of the river. We're not talking about that. Republic of Congo is a country up here north of the river, bordered by, would be the Ubangi. A lot of people have heard of the Ubangi, which is a big tributary of the Congo. Gabon is here. This, as the crow flies, is about, I think, 1,000 miles. Almost continuous Central African forest. On September 20th, 1999, Fay, with this crew of, I thought maybe I could just grab that microphone, of 12 pygmy forest helpers, porters, guides, point men, call them whatever you want, very, very skilled forest-dwelling gentlemen, assistants, started walking from a little village in the Republic of Congo called Bomassa, September 20th, 1999. Set out that morning to walk to the Atlantic Ocean on a zigzag path, roughly like that. The logic of his path was determined by him having identified 13 great blocks of nearly untouched forest that stretched from that corner of the northeastern corner of the Republic of Congo, across the Republic of Congo, to across Gabon to the Atlantic Ocean. One of the ways I've described it in one of the magazine articles that I wrote about this was that it represented essentially 13 great gobbets of meat on a skewer, and the skewer is very bent. A great big kebab of tropical forest. These blocks of forest were jammed together, edge to edge, and what defined the edges was some sort of human presence, occasional human presence or permanent human presence. A road, a railroad line, a river with some villages along it and some boat traffic. In some cases, just a trail that functioned as a backcountry highway. Each of these 13 areas was defined around its perimeter by some sort of human impact, human presence like that. More importantly, in the interior, there was no permanent human presence and very little sign of even past or temporary presence. So the interior of these 13 forest blocks are as virtually untouched Central African rainforest as you can find. And Fay decided that he wanted to know what was in them. He wanted to walk through them in order to perform a survey, in order to perform a biological transect. And quickly he hit upon the name megatransect to describe this mad venture. Fay is an American-born ecologist. He's been in Central Africa about 25 years, trained originally as a botanist, did his PhD on gorilla behavior and diet, and therefore came to know the forest from the bottom to the top, all the way up the food chain, from the plants to the largest of the charismatic megafauna, meaning forest elephant, gorilla, leopard, chimpanzee, bongo, and other kinds of large antelope. He talked his employer, the Wildlife Conservation Society, into letting him go on this long survey venture, and he talked the National Geographic Society into paying for it. He's a persuasive guy. And so he set off on September 20th, 1999, with this crew of 12 pygmy assistants and with a photographer named Nick Nichols and myself tagging along to document this walk for a series of 3 articles in National Geographic magazine. I walked with him for the first 13 days, and then turned around and walked out and left and went to Paris and healed my feet and ate while he continued walking. He walked from that original starting point through an area called Nuabali Ndoki National Park, down out of that through a number of timber concessions, where one of the very few areas he walked through where there was heavy human impact, out of the timber concessions, across the Sangha River, into the green abyss, cut his way through those Marantaceae stems for 10 weeks, came out, walked through Odzala National Park, which at that point was one of the great reserves for forest elephant and also lowland gorilla. This was before Ebola struck Odzala in Central Africa. Kept walking, walked up along a divide that separates the Congo drainage from another major drainage in Gabon, the Ogooué drainage, crossed over that divide. At this point, he was having some desperate trouble because one of his pygmy helpers, a fellow named Muko, was very, very sick. At first, Fay thought that this fellow was going down to malaria. Then he realized it was hepatitis, and that Muko seemed to be dying of hepatitis while they were on the trail. He told himself at that point, and it was recorded in his journal, well, if Muko dies, that's it. That's the end of the mega transect. I'll pack up and I'll take the body home, back to the Babangeli people in northeastern Congo, where he had found Muko and these other fellows. But he nursed Muko, and they limped along to the Gabonese border and eventually got Muko to a regional hospital, evacuated Muko and the whole group of Congolese pygmies were not allowed to cross the border, so they went back to their home forest, the forest whose sounds we were hearing earlier. Fay crossed the border and put together another crew consisting of half pygmies of a different ethnic group, now Baka pygmies, native to Gabon rather than Republic of Congo, and a number of big, burly Bantu laborers from gold camps on the upper Ivindo River, the Ivindo essentially forming the border between the two countries. And there are a number of gold camps up there, and Fay went into these gold camps and talked to men, interviewed them, described this job that he had to offer. Would you like to carry a bag of gear and walk through the forest with me from here to the Atlantic Ocean? And he did a little bit of psychological as well as physical profiling. And he picked 6 or 7 fellows who were just strong enough and just crazy enough that he thought, well, these guys could probably do it with me, and they might be willing to. So then he continued through Gabon with these fellows, walked through some more areas where nobody had ever been, as far as any evidence shows. Walked down along the lower Ivindo River, past some huge falls called the Kongu Falls that are a block to navigation by dugout canoe between the upper Ivindo and the lower Ivindo. Walked through an area along the Ivindo that is now known as the Longwe Ivindo area, where he found large clearings in the forest that are called bais, B-A-I. These exist in Republic of Congo to some extent, and also in Gabon. A bai is a naturally made meadow in the midst of the Central African forest, probably caused originally because there's some sort of a stream that contains some sort of a mineral deposit, and elephants, forest elephants over time, have come there to dig up, grout out the minerals, and ended up pulling up the trees, opening a clearing, trampling the vegetation so that soggy condition loving, sun loving sedges and grasses can grow there. And once that happens, the buy gets bigger and bigger until eventually it might be 10 or 20 acres. And commonly on an early morning might be filled with 10, 15 forest elephants. In mid-morning might have 1 or 2 groups of lowland gorillas. You might be able to put 13 lowland gorillas in the field of your binoculars looking out onto one of these buys from a discreet hiding place. That's my watch reminding me that I don't want to talk on and on about this because I want to get to some of the questions and conclusions about Central African forest and wilderness. So I'll finish this part briefly. After 456 days of fighting his way through this sort of terrain, walking behind a very, very tireless pygmy point man, a second one now, a fellow named Bebe that I think I mentioned, with his faithful forest crew carrying the gear behind him, and for parts of that stretch, his faithful photographer, Nick Nichols, walking with him, and for parts of that stretch, his faithful Boswell Quammen walking with him and scribbling notes in a little reporter's notebook. At the end of 456 days, Fay and the crew and Nick and I come bursting out of the forest onto the beach, and there is the Atlantic Ocean. And by God, against all the odds and against all expectations, he's made it. He's walked a zigzag course, 2,000 miles, over the course of 456 days without a hot shower or a roof, from northeastern Congo to the Atlantic, the megatransect. A lot of people beforehand were saying, he may do it, he may not, so what? Afterwards, a lot of people were still saying, so what? Part of the answer to that, so what, is that, I'll jump forward in time now. That was December 18th, the year 2000. We published the 3 stories about Fay and the megatransect in National Geographic. It made him a relatively famous, crazy white adventurer and conservationist. And the National Geographic Television also did a film called Africa Extreme that some of you may have seen. One of the people who saw the magazine articles and the film was a fellow named El Hadj Omar Bongo, who is president of Gabon. And he saw things in the film and in the magazine articles that he didn't realize existed in his country, which is still 75 to 80% forest, contains only 1.2 million people, has been having a thriving economy on oil revenues, but is starting to run out of oil. President Bongo realized that it was time to think about the future of Gabon beyond oil extraction. And he got inspired by this crazy white American who walked across Gabon and identified these amazing places that no one had been really aware of. No one had seen except by Cessna at 500 feet. So on August 30th of the year 2002, right before getting on a plane to go to Johannesburg for the international, I think it was the Earth Summit that was held in Johannesburg in September of 2002, the World Conference on Sustainable Development, et cetera, et cetera. I don't remember the exact title, but the big World Earth Sustainable Conservation Summit in Johannesburg. Before going to that, President Bongo said, "Give me the declarations that you've been talking about for 13 new national parks." There was a team of people from the Wildlife Conservation Society, World Wildlife Fund, and several other organizations. that had been studying for years and putting together some national parks proposals for Gabon. And they had identified a number of areas, some of which were areas that Fay walked through. Inspired by Fay and his walk and the attention that it brought to Gabon, President Bongo surprised everyone and said, I don't want to do this in a piecemeal way. I know you wanted me to sign one of these decrees and you thought that maybe eventually you might get all 13 of them in a network of national parks. But I'm impatient and I'm going to Johannesburg and I'm inspired by Mike Fay and I want to make a big press announcement. So give me all 13 decrees and we're going to turn Gabon this afternoon into one of the leading conservation countries, at least in terms of percentage of land territory devoted to national parks in the world. And he did that. And he signed the 13 decrees, and Gabon is now 11% national park, which puts it in a category, I believe, only with Costa Rica in terms of percentage dedication to national parkland, and it's much larger than Costa Rica. So, yeah, it was a concrete result and a very, very good thing. Not just because of decrees and not just because of lines on a map, but because President Bongo, with some help from international organizations, committed himself to making these parks reality on the ground. Putting money into infrastructure development, money into training of wardens and naturalists and park guards to protect these areas, and really making them reality. At that point, the U.S. State Department came in. Fay, among other things, is a fairly persistent and somewhat cunning lobbyist, and he was sending emails from the middle of the forest on his laptop by satellite link up to some of the contacts he'd made back in the U.S. State Department. And about that time, the State Department declared a $53 million commitment to something called the Congo Basin Forest Partnership. And a fellow named Colin Powell was also going to Johannesburg, and he also wanted to make some sort of a positive announcement, knowing that the U.S. was going to very justifiably get beat up at the Johannesburg Earth Summit for all the horrible things that we're doing and all the things that we're not doing in terms of climate change and conservation around the world. So for a little bit of strategic cover, the State Department gave Colin Powell this announcement to make: $53 million to the Congo Basin Forest Partnership, some of which was intended to go to help President Bongo with his 13 new national parks. Now that sounds sort of nice, but all of us, probably with a little pause and mental arithmetic, can quickly realize that $53 million from the U.S. government for the Congo Basin is not really very much. Matter of fact, I did some of the mental arithmetic driving over here today in the car, and I think $53 million is about what we spend in 4 hours on the war in Iraq. It's $2 billion a week, isn't it? That's what my mental arithmetic tells me anyway. So that's a story and a little bit of a sense of a place. Then there's a question: what, if anything, does this have to do with the way we think about wilderness, either with a small w or a capital W in this country? And I'm not sure myself. I'd actually like to go back and forth with you a little bit on that. One of the things that I did as I was thinking about what I might say to you tonight, besides looking over some of my old notes and the stories of the Megatransect, was to reread an essay by William Cronin, the environmental historian at the University of Wisconsin, on wilderness, called The Trouble with Wilderness, that appeared in a book about 11 years ago titled Uncommon Ground Toward a Reinvented Nature, or something like that. But anyway, the essay by Bill Cronin, The Trouble with Wilderness, was very controversial, when it originally appeared, but I thought also very clear-sighted and astute. And it may be something that, that people read as part of the Wilderness Studies program or the Environmental Studies program here. I'm not sure. And let me just ask, quick show of hands, how many people have ever read Bill Cronin's The Trouble with Wilderness? Okay, yeah, all right. A pretty good sizable sprinkling anyway. Well, one of the things that Cronin talks about in there is the notion, the common notion, not his notion, that people should not be part of wilderness, that wilderness should be pristine. It represents a state of landscape, as he puts it, that in a sense denies history because it denies human presence and human impact. And I think that's kind of ironic. I swore to myself that I wasn't going to talk about Charles Darwin tonight. But let me say just one thing about Darwin in connection with this unexpected link to wilderness. I think that Bill Cronin is right when he says that that is part of the conventional wilderness designation, statutory understanding of wilderness. Not that there is a complete absence of humans, but that there is a disconnectedness from human use, human impact, and to some extent, therefore, human history. We can argue about that because that's a gross oversimplification, and I'll be curious to hear what you think. But it seems to me ironic that we should have this idealized sense that wilderness is something separate from humans and human use and human impact, and yet we spend so much effort, at least I know I have and others have, when it comes to the subject of evolution, whether it's going to be taught in the public schools, how it's going to be understood, the lessons, the great lessons that come from Charles Darwin's work and from evolutionary biology in general. We spend a lot of time making the point that the really dangerous and the really wonderful thing about Darwin's theory, Darwin's insight, was that it reaffirms the connectedness of humans with nature. It reaffirms the unity of nature with humans included. It lumped us with nature, the theory of evolution, in a way that we had not been lumped for thousands of years. And that was extremely important and an extremely, I think, healthy, salubrious aspect of Darwinian theory. It reminded us that we humans, Homo sapiens, are not separate from nature, not distinct from nature, not above nature. We're connected to nature. We're part of nature. Seems like we should feel that way in terms of landscape, too. However we understand the term wilderness, it seems as though we should remember that we and our history are part of it, connected to it, within it, properly. And then how that plays out in terms, as I said, of the things we value about wilderness, the way we measure those things, and how we try to preserve them becomes a much more complicated question. I think I'll stop right there and ask for some dialogue. Ask for some questions, some comments, some reactions from you, and then I can talk more about the parks of Gabon if you want, and more about the mega transect if you want. But I'd like to know what people are thinking about these things that I've suggested might be connected. And I'd ask you to holler out your questions so everybody can hear them.
Most of society really doesn't know wilderness is not, because we have very few people in here who have mentioned for more than 35 years. So we don't really know wilderness in its evolutionary sense. So as much as there is that dualism, we're still that.
I think that's true, yeah. Could everybody hear that? Most people hear it? he was saying that we don't know wilderness in this country because most people, at least most non-Native American people in North America, only have at most 3 to 5 generations of contact with this landscape. I think that's true. I wondered a lot while I was over there about how these different groups of African men that we were walking with thought about the forest. And as I said, Fay had one team that was all Babangeli Pygmy from a very remote area of northeastern Republic of Congo, and who were very traditional Babangeli Pygmies. They were living forest lives. They had not been acculturated, brought into the villages, started to labor for wages for the Bantu overlords. They were very traditional Babangelis, and that's why he chose them, because they were forest people. They knew how to move in the forest. They knew how to live in the forest. They knew how to climb trees and find honey, and find all of their food and build their temporary lodgings in very simple ways in the forest. The forest was their home. For the Bantu people in Central Africa, it's very different. The Bantu people are physically a much larger people. They emigrated down into Central Africa from the northwest, as far as we know, sometime in the last 1,000, 2,000 years. To a great extent, they subjugated the Pygmies, and they built villages and towns and eventually countries out of this area. A very different relationship to the forest. And the Bantu fellows that we were walking with had a very different relationship to the forest from the Pygmies who were with us during the second leg of the walk across Gabon, when the team was half Pygmy and half Bantu. They were much less comfortable in the forest. They were brave men. They were physically tough men, but they were not at home in the forest. The Pygmies, one of the things that allows the Pygmies to be at home in the forest is just the fact that their population density is very, very low. Living in the forest the way the Pygmies do is a population density dependent sort of privilege. And that's one of the things I wonder about as we're in there starting to change some of these areas, starting to bring health care, for instance, to Pygmies. Pygmies are in a lot of areas being lured out of the forest and coming into the villages to work for wages. They are torn between their love for the forest and their love for physical comforts, the comforts of modern life that we all sort of enjoy. So there's a lot of change going on, and all it will really take will be increase in population density of Babangeli Pygmies to change their relationship to the forest, and I'm not sure how that will play out, but you can only make so many cuts of saplings with machetes to build temporary hunting camps before the forest begins to show some wear and tear. It was really roundabout. I don't know that it had much to do with your statement, but yeah.
I think the buys that you were talking about are an interesting place to
The buys?
The buys to tease out what we're talking about when we talk about wilderness, because I would think that most people offhand would think of that as a piece of a wilderness. Yet what you were describing with the elephants going in there and rooting around, they're pulling minerals out of the ground, they're acting with intention, not the intention to create this different space in the ecosystem, but with that effect. If that was us going in there cutting down trees, say, we wouldn't call it wilderness.
Mm-hmm. Elephants are a funny species, or two species now. The forest elephant is now officially a separate species from the savanna elephant. Forest elephant is a Loxodonta cyclotis, I think. And anyway, both species of elephants, again, can be very, very destructive depending on their population density, and that's been a big problem in the confined areas of East African parks, areas where elephants have been protected since the ivory ban Elephant populations have rebounded, but elephant migrations are restricted because of human usages and threats outside of the parks. And you probably have all heard about this, but elephants can do an awful lot of damage when there are too many of them in too much of a confined space. In the Central African forests, it's not really a problem, and I don't think you were saying this was necessarily a problem, but disruption by elephants, this kind of opening of areas in the forest, is a long cycle, very natural form of just disruption, just the way natural forest fire or windfall from storms is a form of disruption in the forest. And it enriches the carrying capacity of the forest for all different species of wildlife, as I said. So I would still, however we define wilderness, I would still say that these bys certainly fall within the definition.
Certainly. I guess what I'm driving at is that there can be human effects that create different sorts of niches and ecosystems, and we wouldn't hesitate to rule them out as wilderness. I'm just sort of trying to create a problem maybe with our intuitive notion of what it is to have this thing which is separated, what's the time scale of a natural process, and this sort of thing.
Yeah. Another part of the question of human disruption and the history of this whole forest area is the question of whether there was a large human population in this area in the past, in the distant past, say 900 to 1700 years ago. And there is some evidence for that. It's evidence that partly comes from Fay. When he was doing his dissertation on gorillas in the Central African Republic, he started finding palm nuts of a certain oil palm species in the rivers. Little nuts about the size of an acorn, very hard, that are the nut in the interior of the fruit of a particular species of oil palm called Elaeus guineensis. And Elaeus guineensis is thought of as essentially a domesticated species of palm that's grown in Central Africa still today for its oil. It can't grow up from a forest understory. It can't grow up anywhere except in disturbed land, and it tends not to be seen anywhere except in plantations surrounding villages, along rivers where there is light penetration, and this particular palm can thrive. Like bananas. Bananas grow the same way. They need garden openings in the forest. They can't grow up from the forest understory. But if you go anywhere and you see a number of banana plants and you see a number of these palms sticking up, then you think either there's a village there, or until recently there was a village there, because somebody had to make room for those palms and those banana plants to grow. In most of these areas where Fay began his study, and then some of the big areas he walked through, there were none of these palms. The forest was continuous. There were no villages. There were no gardens. There were none of these palms. But he started finding the palm nuts in the river when he would walk across the river, and he was constantly to travel in this area. I didn't talk about the dress code on this expedition, but Fay was always traveling in a pair of Tiva sandals and river shorts so that he could cross swamps, he could cross shallow rivers, he could cross rivers that were less shallow. He would go places that other biologists wouldn't go because he just wasn't worried that the water and the mud was going to be too deep for his rubber boots. He would just go. So he was crossing a lot of these small and medium-sized streams, and he started finding all these palm nuts, hundreds, thousands of these palm nuts. He eventually estimated that there were millions of these palm nuts that seemed to be sunk and preserved in these streams, in the stream beds. And yet there were no palm trees around. What was the deal there? Had there been people here who were growing palms? So at some point in the past, so he took a sampling of these. I think it was 80 palm nuts, and he sent them back. He collected them from 16 different sites, 5 nuts from each site, and he sent them back to a laboratory in Florida to be radiocarbon dated, these palm nuts. The youngest of them were 700 years old. The oldest were like 2,400 years old. They were ancient palm nuts, and they had been preserved because they were in the tannin-rich, acidic black water of these streams. They just weren't rotting. They were just sitting there underneath a light layer of sand. So he started speculating, well, there seemed to have been an awful lot of these oil palm trees, these domesticated oil palm trees, 900, 1,000, 1,400 years ago in this area where there are now no humans. How is this oil processed now? In the places where people are still keeping these palm trees in gardens along their villages, what they do is they harvest the palm fruit, and it comes in big grape-like bunches. A bunch might weigh 50 pounds, and they separate the fruit. They put it into some sort of a receptacle, like a dugout canoe, and they squash it, mash it, like you would mash grapes if you were making old-fashioned Chianti. And then they rinse it with water. They keep putting water into these dugout canoes and dumping it out, rinsing it, and eventually they let it sit, and the palm oil separates out from the crushed fruit because it's lighter than the water and floats on top of the water. So they skim the oil off, and then they throw the water and evidently the palm nuts back into the rivers. That's how the nuts apparently get into the rivers. But Fay was finding very few palms and a lot of ancient nuts, and he started speculating and wrote a chapter on this in his dissertation, that there was once a very sizable population of pre-Bantu, maybe call them proto-Bantu people, thousands, maybe millions of people living in this area, these forests, 1,500 years ago, 900 years ago, and then they disappeared, like the Anasazi disappeared from the southwest. And eventually their palm trees disappeared too because they were overgrown by the natural forest. And all that remained are the palm nuts in the rivers. And then the question becomes, why did they disappear? And he speculates on that. Was it the rise of slavery destroying their cultures? Was it warfare? Was it maybe disease? Was it Ebola back then? Not much evidence to go beyond speculation. Yeah.
How do you think about wilderness in the context of a global human population of 6 billion plus, with the associated habitat destruction and, as we're seeing, radical climate change?
How do I or do we think about wilderness in the context of 6 billion people, rapid climate change? With great difficulty. I mean, it's hard to know, it's hard to imagine that we're going to be able to fence off in any legal or physical sense large areas or even small areas that we can reasonably call wilderness. I'm very pessimistic about that. Not just because we won't have wilderness and the idea of wilderness, but because of the more practical, measurable things, values that we also want to conserve, which is sheer biological diversity. I mean, I'm more comfortable talking about conserving biological diversity, frankly, than conserving wilderness, because wilderness is something that has diaphanous and variable definitions from one person to another, whereas biological diversity is something that you can measure and you can even count it. And yet, no matter how you count it, it's going to be hard to preserve intact ecosystems and much biological diversity as we continue to arrogate more and more of the planet. I don't have an answer to that except to say that I feel like there's nothing that should allow us to underestimate the odds against being able to do that very successfully, and yet there's nothing more important that we should try to do. And therefore, one soldiers on, despite the odds being very, very bad.
The national park movement often marginalized local cultures who possess traditional ecological knowledge to best manage certain areas. And
Really loud, if you would, so they can hear you over here too, as well as me hearing you.
national park movement has often marginalized local cultures who possess traditional ecological knowledge to best manage areas. And how was that fact factored into the preservation of forests in Gabon?
Most of these, how are the needs and rights of local people taken into account when national parks are created, specifically in Gabon? Most of these areas contain no local populations. Nobody is living in most of these forests. It becomes an issue if you look at logging concessions and argue that logging tropical forest provides good jobs for local people. That argument is sometimes made, but I think it's kind of a dead-end argument, and I don't think it's what you're really talking about either. It's not nearly as persuasive as the issue of local people like the Maasai in East Africa, and the question of what rights have the Maasai lost as big national parks have been created, say, in Kenya and Tanzania. There was concern for that in most of the areas of Gabon. I can't tell you park by park. I know some of the parks and have walked through some of the parks with Fay. I don't know all of them. And I can't swear that there is no negative impact on the use rights, or at least the use desires of local people in any of those areas. That's an important discussion and an endless one too, the whole question of parks versus people. And I should say that another thing I looked at before coming over here to talk about these things was the fact of Amboseli National Park in Kenya being de-gazetted as a national park. This happened, I think, I think it was August of 2005. I don't know if any of you have heard about that, but this is one of the things that's going to happen as we continue to expand our human population and our human demands on landscape. Not only is it going to be harder to set aside protected areas, but it's going to be harder to maintain the ones that are already legally set aside in that status. We don't have a name commonly used for that in the American English language, but the Brits call it de-gazetting, which means undoing park protection. And Amboseli, by an act of the President of Kenya, has been de-gazetted and turned from a national park into, I think it's now being called a natural reserve, and it's no longer managed by the Kenya Wildlife Service, but now is managed by one of the county commissions of one of the subgroups of the Maasai people. And it's because of the continuous ebbing and flowing back and forth of this question, this anguish of indigenous peoples' rights versus park protection. How about way back there?
How do you define wilderness in respect to human civilization? Is there a distinct difference? And if not, how could shifting our mentality benefit the human society's relationship with the surrounding landscape?
That's a carefully thought out and written out question. By the way, anybody who has to take off, how are we doing on time? It's getting close to 8:30. Anybody who has to take off, feel free, and we'll do a few more questions here and then finish up. So the easy part of your question was, how do I define wilderness? Let me answer that, and then we'll go back to the harder part. How do I define it? I don't define it because I usually don't use the term. I talk about the forest. I talk about it in relative terms. Some forests are very, very intact. There's not much human impact. I looked at that question. Let me read you a couple of other people's thoughts on that. William Cronin, in that essay I talked about, said this: "Wilderness is the place where, symbolically at least, we try to withhold our power to dominate." It's the place where we try to withhold our power to dominate. Wallace Stegner, whose name honors the chair that I'm flattered to hold at Montana State now, wrote something on the subject too, which gets at the question, although he's not specifically defining. He talks about the special mark about humans that distinguishes us from all other species. It's rare enough in humans, but it's impossible in all other forms of life. And this is similar to what Cronin said about wilderness. He says it's simply the deliberate and chosen refusal to make any marks at all. We are the only species which, when it chooses to do so, will go to a great effort to save what it might destroy. So I think maybe if you can define wilderness, then wilderness in a natural, non-statutory, non-legal sense is simply the wildest place you can find where the ecosystem is so rich and so intact and so formidable that you surrender yourself to it when you go into it. And in a more formal, more statutory sense, it's the place where we exercise this very special capacity of humans to say, okay, we could use this, we could abuse this, we could destroy this, we could tame this, but we choose not to. Should I make a try at the second half of your question? What was it? Give it to me again.
So as a society, we see the two as distinct differences. Civilization ends here, the wilderness starts here. How do you think embracing that mentality could benefit our society as a whole, or our practices, our ecological practices?
This comes back to what I said about Darwin. We, more than anything, in terms of our relationship with the other species and the wild places on this planet, I think we need to be reminded that we're not separate from nature. We are a primate. We are a result of an evolutionary continuum. We're part of nature. And I don't think that we should allow ourselves to believe that dualism that you're talking about and that some of these other people have talked about, either in connection with our specialness as a species, and this goes to questions, tricky religious questions like, do we have a soul and are we immortal? I don't think we should allow ourselves to think that we are disjunct, completely separate and special as a species, and I think that we shouldn't think of any parcels of land on this planet as so special that human presence and to some degree human use isn't part of them. And here's what Wendell Berry said. He talks about we should remember that essentially nature is our house. We make a house in nature as we take care of land. And he talks about that making a house in nature as the forever unfinished life work of our species. And then this is the part that I thought was very interesting. Berry says, the only thing we have to preserve nature with is culture. The only thing we have to preserve nature with is culture. The only thing we have to preserve wildness with is domesticity. And he's getting at that same effort to blur the dichotomy, blur the disjunct between us and nature and between one kind of landscape and another. Lori, how are we doing on time?
We have time for one more question, but before we take the final question, I'm going to give you all a very easy way to find out where next week's lecture is. I'm going to put our phone number for the Wilderness Institute on the board. You can call. It will be on the voicemail. That way you know exactly where it is if you'd like to come here to Jane Benion's talk next week. So one more question.
Okay, one more question.
I'm just wondering what a national park in Gabon how it's structured. You know, I'm sure it's different from how we structure a national park. You know, like, is it more like we would think of a national forest, or is it more like we would think of a wilderness area, or I don't know exactly what you mean by national park in behind.
It's a question that they're answering as they go along. They're making it up as they go along. One of the things that it involves is a line on the map. It involves taking the timber leases that have been sold to timber companies for virtually every patch of forest in Gabon and retiring them, buying them back from the timber companies so that the timber companies are not able to go in there and are not going to go away desperately mad. And then it involves beginning to build some infrastructure, for instance, guard posts on the rivers so that people cannot go in and poach elephants and bring the ivory out by water, establishing guard checkpoints on the rivers. That's very important. Guarding and enforcement is a big part of it, and making sure that the guards are well-trained, well-paid, well-motivated, that their morale is high, and armed. And the rest, as I say, they're making up as they go along. But they're also they're making a big effort to establish ecotourism in some of these parks, and that's another point where I start to become pessimistic, because you hear about ecotourism as part of the solution for every country and every patch of wild landscape on the planet. Part of the solution is going to be ecotourism to replace the revenue that formerly was coming or expected from extractive uses. And ecotourism makes really good sense in places like East Africa, where you can check into a comfortable lodge and go out on the veranda at sundown and have a gin and tonic and look out over a watering hole and see 12 elephants and 47 zebras. But in the Central African rainforest, you work very hard to see the animals that you see. You don't see them very well for very long, and you have to really, really like walking through mud. And swatting at sweat bees and being bit by filaria flies and tsetse flies, and sitting quietly in this kind of a context, maybe to get a glimpse of a gorilla, to do ecotourism. And I'm wary and skeptical because it's not for everybody. On that cheerful note, thank you again so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.